am yeah. Okay, so my name is Annika Mukherjee, and I'm the lead advocate for one of the teams of the Youth Action Campaign, which is an organization that is part of the Red Cross. What we kind of aim to do is we try to create a peer-to-peer campaign over the course of the school year and essentially try and advocate for international humanitarian law. And each year we have a different theme. So like last year, our theme was education in war. And so this year, our theme kind of surrounds the preservation of cultural artifacts and the role that international humanitarian law plays in that. So today we have our fabulous guest speaker, Johnathan Gooch, who has generously agreed to come and talk to us today about that. So I guess I'll hand it over to you, Mr. Gooch.
Yeah, hi. So if this has been your theme, a lot of this will probably not be new to some of you. But to start, my name is Johnathan. So professionally, I am a communications director, or the communications director at Equality Texas, which is an LGBTQ advocacy group. But I'm here today because I volunteer with the Red Cross as an international humanitarian law instructor. And I have a law degree. When I was in law school, I specialized in international later to talk about the difference. Yeah, so I'm excited to be here. And today I'm just going to give you a sort of broad overview of cultural property in warfare, why it's important, and the source for essentially modern law regarding cultural property and the protections for cultural property in warfare. So perhaps the most obvious place to start is, what is cultural property? So this is a really long definition. It comes from the beginning of the Convention for the Protection of Cultural Property in the Event of Armed Conflict. So this definition, like I said, is at the beginning of this treaty to explain what cultural property is. And I'm just going to read it really quickly, and then we can talk about it. So cultural property shall cover, irrespective of origin or ownership, property of great importance to the cultural heritage of every people, such as monuments of architecture, art, or history, whether religious or secular, archaeological sites, groups of buildings, which as a whole are of historic or artistic interest, works of art, manuscripts, books, and other objects of artistic or historical or archaeological interests, as well as scientific collections and important collections of books, or archives of reproductions of the property defined above, and museums that house those artifacts. So I guess the reason I put this definition up is because it's not really much of a definition, is it? It's more of a list. And I think the fact that the authors of this treaty struggled to define cultural property in a simple way is sort of an interesting conundrum, an interesting problem that is faced with cultural property and protecting cultural property, because what we define as cultural property almost seems intuitive. So I would like to, I don't want to put anyone on the spot because of this, but I would just encourage you guys, I would love to hear what you think. What is cultural property like in Texas? What's an example of Texas cultural property? Does anything come to mind to anyone? Someone
maybe the Alamo.
The Alamo. The Alamo is the thing that came to my mind. That's there. Can you see the Alamo? So the Alamo, right? It's iconic. Everyone associates it with Texas. It has a complicated history, right? It was built during the Spanish colonial era. It was a place where the Catholic Church forced the Native community to do labor. Obviously, later it was part of the Texas Revolution. And so there are some complicated stories with that too. So for better and for worse, the Alamo is very much a part of Texas cultural history. And so that's an interesting one, and it's just sort of intuitive to us. We recognize that that's important. Any ideas about what would be cultural property for the United States? Any thoughts? Someone must have a thought.
Could the White House be considered cultural property?
The White House is a great example. It's iconic. What came to my mind was the Statue of Liberty. So the Statue of Liberty, it was a gift from the French, right? It's not even, and yet it's a part of American culture. It's a symbol of America. It came to America 100 years after the founding of America, right? It hasn't been in America as long as America has been around, and yet it's still very much tied up with the identity of America. So it's another example of cultural property. Any thoughts on what might count as global cultural property? So there are probably a lot of things you could do with this one, but I thought of the Eiffel Tower, right? The loss of the Eiffel Tower would not just be a loss to Paris, it would be a loss to the world. And even though Paris has been occupied and a thriving city since the Roman Empire, and the Eiffel Tower has not been there nearly as long, it's still identified with Paris in a very unique way, with the fabric of the city. So it's part of the cultural heritage. And I guess I wanted to go through those examples because they seem sort of intuitive, and yet the authors of that treaty had trouble articulating for themselves what cultural property was outside of a list. So I would love to hear if anyone has thoughts. I mean, does anyone have a thought that links those three objects? You guys have been dealing with this. I'm sure some of you have been thinking about it.
I would probably say like all of these places are connected in that they were like historically important, probably.
Sure, yeah. Historic importance, I think, is a really good one, and that's definitely a theme that runs through all of those objects. Any other thoughts?
Could it be like an object that's maybe like integral to a nation's identity, or something that's helped shape that? I guess it also has something to do with history.
For sure, yeah, their identity though, but that's a little different than just history, right? Not all parts of our history are part of our identity, but some parts stand out as really being part of our identity as a nation or a state or globally. So I think that's interesting to note. I just wanted to flag that at the beginning, that what defines cultural property is not a simple thing to define, even though it might be a simple thing to recognize. It's easy for us to recognize cultural property, but it's hard sometimes to say exactly what is it, what's common to all cultural property, because there are different reasons we might value different parts of our culture. So I want to look at a few examples of cultural property that has been impacted by warfare, just to underscore the significance and the importance of protecting cultural property in warfare. So I'm going to start with the most recent, the Buddhas of Bamiyan, and I will be the first to confess my ignorance. I do not know how you pronounce Bamiyan, but this is in Afghanistan. So I'm trying to remember now, I think it was around 600 AD, there was a thriving community of Buddhists in this part of Afghanistan. And so they were creating art, and they built these monumental sculptures. That sculpture you see there is 180 feet tall, and there's another similar one. So they were in this part of Afghanistan thriving as a community, and then they were there until, and the date is escaping me, but I think it's around 1000 AD, probably a little earlier. They were driven out, but the Buddhas, these two Buddhas of Bamiyan, stood there for over 1,000 years until 2001. So they were destroyed in 2001 by the Taliban. The Taliban called the statues idols. And as you can see there in this image, it's hard to even tell that there was a sculpture there ever. So that's just an invaluable piece of cultural heritage that has been lost. It's something that I think is not only significant to Afghanistan, but significant to the Buddhist community, significant to the world, right? This is a really unique space with some really unique art that told a story of a unique culture right, in Afghanistan. So then going further back in history, St. Lambert's Cathedral in Belgium. So St. Lambert was assassinated in Liège in 705 AD. And he was buried in Liège, and his burial site became a place of pilgrimage. So people were coming to this place to worship and to pray, and a couple buildings were built. Eventually a church was built. And then around the year 1000 AD, this cathedral was built, the Cathedral of St. Lambert. And so it was there for about 800 years. This giant cathedral was there for about 800 years. And after the Liège Revolution, when the city was under French occupation, the cathedral was destroyed in 1794. It was demolished, and you can see there in the pictures what it looks like after being demolished. And interestingly, the lead from the roof was actually used to manufacture weapons. So that's another tragic bit of this story. And perhaps the most famous story of lost cultural heritage is the Library of Alexandria. So Alexandria was under attack a lot, but there are some key points in history that we know about. The library was burned when there was a conflict led by Julius Caesar. A fire spread to the library, and that was 68 AD. So later, when Emperor Aurelian tried to retake Alexandria, this is in 272 AD, there was more damage to the library. And then the very last possible remnants that still existed of the library were finally destroyed in 642 AD by Amir ibn al-As when his army invaded the city. So this library originally just was one of the largest, most significant libraries of the ancient world. And it housed so much wisdom, so much intelligence, all of these ideas of the ancient world. And it was in a place that was frequently engaged in armed conflict and suffered because of that. And so much cultural heritage, so much wisdom was lost in that destruction. And you can see what it looks like today, which is a shell. So now clearly there is still even some cultural significance, right? Some heritage in the ruins itself, right? In the stories about the library and the architecture of the ruins that remains. But so much of the contents of the library, which in itself was a part of cultural heritage and cultural property, has been lost. So I tell those stories just to highlight why it's important to talk about the preservation of cultural property in armed conflict specifically, because there's great risk to losing cultural property in these situations. So many of you will probably be familiar with the basics of international humanitarian law. I'm going to go over them again quickly to give a sense of how they intersect with the protection of cultural property in wartime. So the first thing to note is that international humanitarian law only applies to armed conflict. And so the reason we say armed conflict and not war is because war is a political declaration right? In the United States of America, war has to be declared by all of Congress voting. And it's been a long time since we did that, but we have still engaged in armed conflicts. So the test of whether or not there's an armed conflict is, does it look like there's an armed conflict, right? Are there people on the ground with guns? Is there violence? And when there is an armed conflict, that's when international humanitarian law applies. So when there's not an armed conflict, that's when international human rights law applies. And to a limited extent, that's probably somewhat oversimplified. There are certain situations when human rights law would apply even during warfare, but for the most part, international humanitarian law deals with war or with armed conflict, and international human rights law deals with peacetime and protecting people during peacetime. So these fundamental principles of international humanitarian law, it's important to note that they are not actual laws. These are abstractions that law professors, lawyers, and academics who have looked at all of the international humanitarian law have stepped back and said, these are the core principles that make up international humanitarian law. So the first principle is military necessity. And the principle of military necessity ties into the fact that international humanitarian law is all about armed conflict. So military necessity is the principle that justifies any measures not forbidden by international law, which are necessary for securing complete submission of the enemy as soon as possible. That principle just really acknowledges the reality of warfare and the fact that there is an aim and a goal in warfare. And so while it does seem largely permissive, it's important to note that there's a little caveat there, not forbidden by international law. And it also does, to a limited extent, narrow the possibilities, because there has to be a military necessity to any attack. So you can't attack a civilian because that doesn't help end the war. Military necessity has to be directly tied to ending the war as soon as possible. And that leads to our next principle, distinction. So the parties to a conflict have to distinguish between the military and between civilians. And part of the way that this is done is with uniforms, right? It's pretty straightforward. If you're fighting in an armed conflict, you have to distinguish yourself by wearing a uniform that signals, I'm part of the armed conflict, I'm open to attack, and I'm engaging in attack. And that protects the civilians by distinguishing who's a legitimate target and who's not. But the same is true for civilian objects and military objects, right? And those are not always as clear, but a distinction has to be made before an attack is made. Is this a civilian object or is this a military object? And civilian objects are not legitimate targets. So the next part of distinction is these distinctive emblems that are actually intimately tied up with the Red Cross. So you'll see here the Red Cross, the Red Crescent, and the Red Diamond. All of those symbols represent the Red Cross, Red Crescent movement. And when someone is wearing these symbols, one of these symbols on the battlefield, it means they're protected. It either means that they're providing medical care to wounded soldiers, right? This might be used to indicate a medic, or it might be used to indicate someone who is a part of the Red Cross or Red Crescent movement. And when someone is wearing these symbols, it indicates that they are not a legitimate target of attack. And part of the reason I wanted to highlight this is because there is a similar distinctive emblem for the protection of cultural property. So proportionality, the principle of proportionality essentially says that when engaging in attack on a legitimate military target, you have to consider what the incidental loss to civilian life or the injury to civilians would be. So if there's a tank that's going through a small village, attacking the tank might be a legitimate military objective, but whoever is executing that attack has to stop and consider how many people are going to be injured. And one of the ways that proportionality ties into this conversation about cultural property is that protected cultural property has to be considered as well in this type of proportionality analysis, right? Say there's this tank going through a small village and there's an ancient church there or an ancient mosque or some monument, right? There has to be consideration given to the value of the cultural property. And the cultural property itself cannot be the target of the attack. So the last principle of international humanitarian law is limiting unnecessary suffering. So this principle is actually not directly relevant to the protection of cultural property, but I wanted to include it while we're going through these core principles. The basic idea is pretty straightforward. There's no need to do anything to harm people beyond what is absolutely necessary, right? We don't want to cause unnecessary suffering, and we don't want to allow that. And that's the core of what that principle stands for. So, having gone through a brief overview of how international humanitarian law operates, I want to turn back to the Hague Convention for the Protection of Cultural Property in the event of armed conflict. So this was drafted in 1956. It has been signed and ratified by 133 countries, including America, including Ukraine, including Russia. Most countries in the world are parties to this treaty. And I think it's important to start with looking at the historical context. So this treaty was drafted at a time when World War II was still very present on everyone's minds. And during World War II, there was a lot of damage to cultural property. There were a lot of bombing raids that destroyed a lot of deep cultural heritage all across Europe. So General Dwight Eisenhower, at the time general, actually said in a letter, he said, "Today we are fighting in a country which has contributed a great deal to our cultural inheritance, a country rich in monuments which by their creation have helped and now in their old age illustrate the growth of the civilization which is ours. We are bound to respect those monuments so far as war allows." So here, Eisenhower is saying this cultural heritage here in Europe is part of our heritage, right? This is Eisenhower from his perspective, recognizing how European culture informed his culture. And so there's definitely a very personal perspective for him in this. So I think that's important to note that part of this shift was recognizing the personal connection to the culture. So it predates the respect for all cultures and all cultural heritage, an idea just that we shouldn't destroy our own cultural heritage that Eisenhower is expressing here. And that's a pretty big shift because up until the end of the Napoleonic Wars, the general attitude was to the victor go the spoils. And there was a lot of looting and pillaging in destroyed cities that were caught up in conflict. There's even been some controversy about certain artifacts in the British Museum, right, that were stolen from different countries during wartime. And that was the way things went for a very long time. But that attitude, I think I would say it resurfaced a bit during World War II. The Nazis were very famous for stealing a lot of cultural artifacts and a lot of art and a lot of history. And even beyond all of that, there's an important note that Lemkin, the man who invented the name genocide, also used it, well, for context, he invented that word to describe what had happened during the Holocaust. It came after the Holocaust. And he also used it in conjunction with this term, cultural genocide. So there was an idea that you could destroy a people, perhaps not physically, they might physically be living, but if you strip them of their culture and their cultural inheritance, you've done something to them that was profound and deeply impacting. So all of those ideas and thought about how to preserve different people's culture was being considered after World War II when they were writing this Hague Convention for the protection of cultural property. And there are a couple key takeaways from the convention. It requires all countries who are signatories to make efforts to protect cultural property, both in peacetime and in wartime. And they have to designate a competent authority to ensure those protections. And there's also an agreement to protect both their own cultural property and that of other signatories. And so part of that is not setting up a military base in a church that's old and historic, right? It wouldn't be legitimate to set up a military base in the Cathedral of Notre Dame. It wouldn't be legitimate to set up a military base in a museum, right? Because that would put into conflict the obligation of the countries to preserve cultural property and their military necessity. So the countries that signed on to this treaty are prevented from manipulating the law like that. So they can't use the protections of cultural property to protect themselves because that actually puts the cultural property at risk. So I mentioned that there is an image, a distinctive image for protection of cultural property. It's the blue shield. And it operates essentially like the Red Cross would, but you'll see this attached to unique historic buildings and things like that. And it's just a protection that signals this is part of the cultural heritage of this place, and it is off limits from attack. And so there's even a heightened protection, which is this blue shield with a red border around it. And that's essentially an indication that under no circumstances can this cultural property be harmed. And so, yeah, I think it's interesting to know that there is such an indicator of cultural property. And so lastly, I think the conflict in Ukraine has been on everyone's mind. So there is a little bit of a risk to cultural property in Ukraine. UNESCO is concerned about it. They have voiced that, and they are currently working with museums in Kyiv to safeguard the cultural property of Ukrainians from attack. There have also been some reports of churches and other things that have been injured and damaged during the conflict. So I suppose that's not the happiest or the most optimistic way to end this brief overview, but it does highlight the importance of thinking about cultural property and the protections for cultural property. And it also underscores the significance of the Hague Convention, because there is a binding law that can hold anyone accountable to damaging cultural property. So just as a side note, there are a couple international courts that both Ukraine and Russia are part of. Specifically, I'm thinking of the European Court of Human Rights. And it's possible that things like this would be litigated there. It's possible. It depends a little bit. But so that's a very broad overview of the law of cultural property, predominantly focused on some of the protections that come out of the Hague Convention. Does anyone have any questions? Any thoughts? I promise you're not being graded.
I guess I had one question. Were there, I guess, could you name some like specific historic artifacts there, like in Ukraine that are like, yeah.
I actually cannot. I mean, I think there are some ancient buildings for sure, but thinking about the museums, which I think is interesting, UNESCO specifically highlighted the museums. So museums are protected under the Hague Convention. It's specifically mentioned, right, museums as places where all of these cultural artifacts are collected. And so I think that's what I keep in mind, right? The very nature of a museum is to protect beautiful things, right? An art museum is all about finding the most important art in a space, the most historic, right? The National Portrait Gallery is about which people do we want to remember, right? And so the museums themselves, I can't speak to what significant cultural property in Ukraine is, but honestly, I feel better trusting the Ukrainians themselves to collect that cultural property in a museum, which I think underlines the importance of protecting the museums that have been carefully curated over time.
And I guess I had one more thing. So so regarding the cultural property in that country, these laws don't just apply to cultural property that is of that specific country, but any and all cultural property from like around the world that is located in that nation?
Yes, yeah. The cultural property is specifically, it's not specifically, it's universal, right? So to go back to, let's see, this of great importance to the cultural heritage of every people. And I think just to supplement this, cultural property specifically is movable or immovable property. But I think something that's interesting to consider in this type of a discussion is that cultural heritage sometimes includes things that are not property. So UNESCO has designated quite a few festivals around the world as global heritage, right? An important part of our global community. But yes, to answer your question, it's not just about preserving Ukrainian culture. Any other cultural property that they may have in their museums or they may have anywhere needs to be preserved. Well, that's all I have for you guys.
Okay, thank you so much for that amazing presentation. Did anyone else have any questions or comments that they wanted to say before we ended the meeting? Okay, that's all right. No worries. Okay, so thank you all for joining. This recording will be available over, I believe, YouTube. It's gonna be posted on, and I will send everyone that link when it is made available. Again, thank you all for joining, and you all should receive an email. Those that signed up through the Google form should receive an email at sometime at the end of the day about the meeting, etc. So yeah, if that was it, Mr. Gooch, I guess, did you want to put your information in the chat? Maybe if anyone had any questions that they wanted to send you, possibly.
Yeah, please feel free to reach out. Again, my specialty is actually international human rights law, but I'm happy to answer questions about that or do what I can to answer more questions about cultural heritage.
Yeah, well, thank you so much. And I guess for those that maybe wanted to learn more about cultural property, stay posted for a few more our events that will be happening. I think we have 2 or 3 more planned, so stay on the lookout for that. And yeah, I guess that's it. Thank you all for joining. Thank you, Mr. Gooch, for coming to speak to us.
Yeah, y'all have a good one.